Hello and welcome to another submarine chat. Like my previous ones, this is going to be unscripted, but I have prepared some material, so we'll see how it goes. In 1969, at the height of the Cold War, some CIA analysts were looking at satellite images of a shipyard in Leningrad, which is now St. Petersburg. And they noticed something unusual. A submarine had been rolled out and its color was showing up as highly reflective. This is unusual. Submarines are made out of steel ordinarily, and steel, when you're working on it, it darkens. It goes essentially almost black. So to have a submarine sitting outside that is silver or highly reflective is unusual. And the analysts concluded that the submarine must be made out of something other than steel. And they realized it was probably titanium. This was quite a big deal because the US and the West couldn't build a submarine out of titanium. It's too difficult. So it implied that the Russians were ahead, certainly in this respect. There was many debates. It seems not everyone believed it was made out of titanium. You know, if the West can't do it, then how can the Soviet Union? But eventually it was confirmed. And apparently the story is quite interesting. Some analysts in the 70s were actually looking at some scrap metal that had been imported to America from the Soviet Union. It was high value or hard to get metals, including titanium. And they found a piece of titanium that had a serial number on it from the objects that it had been created to be part of. And that serial number started with 705. That was really significant because the submarine that they were looking for was the ALFA class submarine, or the Project 705 to the Russians. So it confirmed that the ALFA class submarine was indeed made out of titanium. So why would the Soviets want to build submarines out of titanium? It's pretty straightforward. Titanium is both stronger and lighter than steel. So if you build a submarine using the fact it's lighter, you can make it so that the submarine is much faster. Alternatively, because it's lighter, you can make it thicker, and because it's stronger, it means that the submarine can go much deeper. So you can have any combination of this, but essentially you can build a much higher performance submarine, all other things being equal. Additionally, it's non-magnetic. This is a big deal because one way to detect submarines is by their magnetic signature, and submarines have to be degaussed, but the titanium submarine doesn't have to be. And it's also very resistant to corrosion. This is significant. It's not the most exciting part, but steel submarines rust, and navies have to pay a lot of effort into keeping them in good condition. This submarine, this is the ALFA class. This photograph was taken years after it was built. In fact, it's on its way to end of life, I think. The paint has come away in places, and you can see underneath the paint this shiny white, almost metal. That is titanium. The submarine hull itself is actually in brilliant condition. If it was a steel submarine, it would probably be rust. From the Western perspective, the ALFA class was the first submarine that they were aware of that was built out of titanium. It was the one that got the topic as made it so important. But actually, the Soviets did have an earlier submarine that was made out of titanium, the Papa class. The West knew about it, but it wasn't realized it was made out of titanium. Really impressive submarine. Little bit earlier than the ALFA class, much bigger. It had a very formidable armament of 10 anti-ship missiles. But its performance was, of course, what's interesting. Its dive in depth was very good. 400 meters is deep. It wasn't record setting, but its speed was. It is literally the fastest submarine ever recorded, 44.7 knots. So incredible speed. That's actually faster than the Alpha class. The difference, though, is that the Papa class was just a single boat built. And although it was operational and considered part of the operational fleet, in practice, it had a lot of problems and was seen more or less as experimental. The Alpha class also had lots of problems, teething problems, but was put into series production. It didn't have the anti-ship missiles. It's only about half the size of the Papa class, but it also had the incredible performance. Its speed wasn't as fast, only 41 knots, and its diving depth wasn't as deep as people thought. It was only 350 meters. This is actually really interesting because the Western estimates for both speed and depth were much higher. It was felt that, it'd been calculated, if you like, that it could do 45 knots and that its diving depth, because it's made of titanium, must be really great, maybe 1,000 meters or thereabouts. That drove a perception in the West that we're a bit behind and we had to adapt our requirements to counter the Alpha. The Alpha, if you think about it, came out in the 1970s, but the new torpedoes the current torpedoes, the Spearfish and the ADCAP, were largely built as a response to the Alpha class, and they didn't enter service for many years after the Alpha class. So there was a gap where it was perceived that we didn't have a torpedo that could go fast enough or deep enough to counter this submarine. There was a mistake on the depth. This is my cutaway of it. You can see this on my website. There was a lot more to it than just being titanium. It had an unusual liquid metal reactor. It had an escape capsule, which is unusual at the time. It was highly automated and a very small crew, which was entirely made up of officers. The concept of operations was quite different from other attack submarines. It was, if you like, an interceptor submarine. It would sit in port, wait for it to be needed, and then race out of port to do its business. In reality, it was not a very reliable submarine, and it ultimately can be viewed as not successful. However, its Achilles heel was more than anything the reactor. It wasn't the fact it was made out of titanium. That wasn't the problem. Which is why, when it came to the next generation of submarines, the Russians looked for titanium. There were three types of submarine in what, from a Soviet perspective, would be the third generation. They were designed by different design bureaus. The Rubin Design Bureau, which is still very much involved in submarine design today, came up with the Mike class. That's the Western name, by the way. The Lazarite Design Bureau came up with the Sierra class. And the Malachite Design Bureau came up with the Aquila class, which was steel-hulled. Now, the titanium submarines are the ones we're going to talk about, but you probably know that the Aquila class is the backbone of the Russian Navy today. The titanium hull on the Mike class translated into an incredible diving depth. That was the main feature. On the Sierra class, it was this balance of depth and speed. It was like a super top-of-the-range submarine. And the Aquila class at the time would be perceived almost as the safe bet, the backup, the contingency. Obviously, something's changed there. Starting with the Mike class, this was actually the least ambitious and least different from the preceding generation in terms of warfighting capability. It was a smaller submarine on the inside, less well-armed and so on. However, its claim to fame and what made it so different was its diving depth. It is the deepest diving operational submarine, combat submarine ever, at record depth of over 1,000 meters. There are, of course, research submarines, submersibles that go deeper. But this had torpedoes and so on, and could conduct the fight. Unfortunately for the submarine, less than 10 years after it had been built, there was a tragic accident. What started as a fire led to the submarine being lost in the Norwegian Sea. These are much more recent images from an ROV looking at the wreck site. As mentioned, it started with a fire. It was a tragic loss, and many of the crew lost their lives. However, it wasn't because it was made out of titanium. That wasn't the cause, the issue. The Sierra class was to be a much more, if you like, super submarine, more ambitious. As an aside, the teeth there, you'll recognize that I use that as an avatar. I think it's incredible that brilliant that they painted shark's teeth on it. Nothing to do with the fact it's titanium. This submarine would be much quieter than previous generations of Soviet or Russian submarines and have a much larger torpedo armament. It had 40 weapons in total, including the large and new at the time 650 millimeter torpedoes. That's larger than torpedoes on Western submarines. But its performance was very high in both speed and operating depth, but not record beating in either respect. And it was much larger than the ALFA, largely due to the weapons and quieting. It was followed, the first two of them rather were followed by the Sierra 2, which was a iterative improvement. Visually, the main difference is that it has a much larger, longer sail. Unusually, uniquely even, it has two escape capsules in the sail. Performance and everything's similar. The specs as they're reported are slightly different. I don't know whether that's due to the reliability of the specs on do you get online or how much difference there really was. There was a significant difference in armament, which we'll come back to. Only two of those were built, and there was to be a follow-on Sierra 3 class, but that work on that was cancelled. The first boat was already under construction, I think, but the end of the Cold War, like so many submarine projects, it was the end. So overall, we have one Mike class and 4 Sierra class, 2 Sierra 1s, 2 Sierra 2s. So why so few of these titanium third generation boats? Well, titanium, for all its wonderful properties, it actually has a few drawbacks as well. And this is partly why the Western analysts initially were skeptical that the Russians would be building such submarines. The first one is it's expensive. It's about 3 to 5 times more expensive than steel. That's a figure I got from a CIA report. I don't know the current prices. It also deforms. It's less elastic. So if it does get dented, then it's going to stay dented. That has been a problem for at least one of the submarines. There's very little written about it. I don't know much about that, to be honest. But the biggest problem was that it was difficult to work with. You needed a very clean area. Shipyards aren't generally seen as clean areas. You needed a lot of effort to keep it clean and to use special gases or conditions for welding. It's actually very skilled. So the shipyards to build these submarines had to be very specially equipped, and the workers had to be specially trained. It wasn't something you could just go and build a titanium submarine at any shipyard. And that meant that there was a major constraint on how many that could be built. There was also a less obvious problem with that. And that was that the shipyards that were set up to work with titanium, that developed it and were able to, happened to have physical limitations to how large the submarines could be. And normally when we talk about submarine size, we talk in terms of its displacement or its length. Actually, the diameter or width of the pressure hull is a major and very important factor for how much you can fit inside a submarine. And the Sierra 1 class, which was made out of titanium, partly because of where it was built, was limited to 12.28 meters in diameter. It was double hulled, but I've drawn it very simply. The Akula class, which is the steel-hulled one, was bigger. It was 13.6 meters diameter. It doesn't sound a lot of difference, but it made a massive difference. The Akula class, because of its larger diameter, could fit the larger and newer and better sonar. Whereas the Sierra class, despite being built and conceived as a top-of-the-range submarine, effectively had a less good sonar, and it was down to the physical size limitations of the hull. This was somewhat remedied on the Akula 2, sorry, the Sierra 2, rather. That had the same sonar as the Akula. However, the cost was on the torpedoes. It went from having this mixed large 650 millimeter and regular size 533 millimeter to just having 533 millimeter and having actually fewer torpedo tubes at the same time. Another problem which I've observed, and I don't, I've not read this, so it's just an observation, but the titanium hulled attack submarines, the Sierras, they seem to have much more of a problem with their rubber tiles that are put on the outside of submarine to reduce the acoustic signature. They seem to fall off more. Now, this is a problem that lots of submarines have, Western submarines, Virginia class quite famously, but within Russian submarines, it seems to be much worse on the Sierras than it is on the Akulas, for example. So there seems to be a difference between the titanium hulls and the steel hulls when it comes to the epoxy or the adhesive, however they're attaching the tiles. Possibly it's down to deformation, the hull deforming. I don't know for sure. It's just speculation on my part, but it seems to be the case. Another thing that people have observed seems to be a complication is with the propeller or the screw. This is a fantastic photo. You can see that the screw, well, as an aside, it's interesting, it's got 6 blades, but the point that I want to make is that the screw is sort of white or silver in color. It seems to be made out of titanium, i.e. the same material as the submarine. That's unusual. Normally you have a steel submarine, you don't have a steel propeller. It suggests that there is either a corrosion reason or something driving the need to have a titanium propeller. I don't think it's something that you would choose to do. I don't know for sure that the titanium material makes the propeller noisier. It's more likely to deform, I guess. However, it definitely seems to complicate things. It's not, you're building screws that only go, this whole technology to build a screw is only relevant for these submarines. It must be more expensive. It must be much more of a hassle. So the attack submarines ended with the Sierras. Part of the reason is that the Akula submarine, that contingency submarine made out of steel, turned out to be so good that anyway, the titanium submarines weren't needed as much. The Akulas were really good. Also, the steel itself was improving. So the difference between titanium and steel is less. But there were other submarines that were made out of titanium. Again, by the Soviets, and this has probably become obvious already, it was only the Russians, and is only the Russians, that build submarines out of titanium. But one of the other applications they found was mini subs for special forces operations. 2 Piranhas, or known to NATO as the Losos class, were built. These look sort of very fat, but actually they're very small and they're very lightly built. And so they're using titanium to make a very light submarine, which can have a lot of volume, but not a lot of displacement. As I say, 2 were built. There's lots of rumors. There's certainly the thing of, if in the Swedish archipelago and that sort of thing, people speculate. In reality, they arrived quite late and they were scrapped in the 90s. They're still offered. So if you have millions or billions, then there's a shipyard in Russia that will want to build them for you, but they're no longer in service. And I don't think you'll get anything very much similar. The other use is for really deep diving submarines. And the Russians built some very specialist boats. They call these deep nuclear stations, or AGS. There isn't an equivalent term in the West. The first were three of the uniform class, built in the late 70s and through the 80s. These are still around, although some are no longer active. You'll notice that they have legs that extend out the bottom and pincers or manipulators at the front. That's for working on undersea infrastructure such as internet cables, acoustic, hydrophone arrays and things like that. They have all thrusters all over them. They're really specialist for deep diving, basically spy submarines. They are complemented by a submarine called the X-ray class, just one built. This was very similar in most respects, but smaller. And because it was smaller, it could be carried by a larger submarine, a host submarine or mother submarine, to its area of operation. It's about the same size as the US Navy's NR-1, which was contemporary of it. The X-ray was superseded by the improved Pouters class. Two of those were built. Those are still in service and probably providing good service to your internet cables. They're slightly larger, but again, they can still be carried underneath a host submarine. Another type of this submarine, more modern and the one that's much more famous, is the Lira. This has a slightly different internal arrangement. As you can see, it has 7 orbs or spherical pressure hulls joined together. The reason it is famous is because there was a fire aboard it. On the 1st of July 2019, it was a fatal fire, terrible accident. The submarine itself, though, will be repaired. That's the plan. As of now, it's probably in a shed in Severodinsk being repaired. So that's all the submarines that were or have been built out of titanium that I'm aware of. The first one, the cruise missile armed Papa class. Then there's the ALFA class, which is the one that was first seen by the CIA. Then we had the 3rd generation submarines, the Mike and Sierra, the deep diving ones, and the Losos or Piranha, as it's more popularly known, the special mission submarine. I don't think we'll see any more attack submarines or large submarines built out of titanium. Although the metal properties are still very interesting, it is so expensive and there haven't been any built for so long that it would take a lot to set up production again. What we might see, though, is a deep diving submarine possibly being made out of titanium. The Lira, as I said, has been damaged and is being repaired. That's the plan, but it's taken a long time, and possibly there have been rumors that instead of repairing it, they'll build another one, either similar, let's say, possibly made out of titanium. But again, how are they going to train the people to build it and so on? So I think that's the end of titanium submarines, but very interesting. Only the Russians did it. These are all the classes. Thank you for listening. As has probably been obvious, this was unscripted. If you like it, please let me know and share it. It's not monetized, so please share it widely. Thank you very much.